Spend more and more time online, so we don't know actually what's going to happen in the future, but maybe this is a scenario that may continue in the days ahead. We don't know really. But if this is not enough to contend with, there has been a growing awareness around artificial intelligence. AI has had a huge impact on the creation, the processing, and the circulation of images. Now, what is of interest to me is that in the past, there used to be a unique object or a unique model for fakes and for copies, usually few in numbers. But today, fakes are created ex nihilo from already existing data sets. Now, these techniques basically create very realistic digital images and videos which are very much indistinguishable from the real ones. Here are some examples. Would you say that those are real faces or non-genuine faces? Another example from so-called deep nostalgia. Can a picture of a dead person be animated? Again, another example. Can a deepfake video be so realistic to fool everybody? So here's my question, which is quite straightforward. How do we make sense of face images, which are created artificially, from the point of view of semiotics? I believe that there is here a room for ethical, for epistemological, and for semiotical questions. Now, in order to tackle this issue, I basically frame the whole problem around one single thesis, which is the loss of the referent. This is not my own terminology, as I borrow it from postmodernist theory and from theory of aesthetics, but anyhow, this thesis is quite simple. In fact, it posits that there seems to be a gradual shift from a tight connection of science, today reference, to a situation where science and reference have been basically detached, or where the referent does not seem to exist at all, although the image created gives the impression that the referent exists. Fine. So in order to support this argument, basically I will discuss it from two different perspectives. The one from the, let's say, semiotics of culture, in particular Lotman and Piatigorsky, and the second one from postmodernist perspective, in particular Baudrillard. I contend that although from different premises, those two types of approaches come to the same conclusion. In this presentation, I will also move back and forth between three main concepts. One is the organic phase, the other one is its analog representation, and the third one is its digital representation, which was touched upon just some time ago. The backbone of my speech is as follows. First of all, I will discuss some illustrations taken from the history of semiotics that signals the relation between indexes and human faces. Secondly, I will lay out what is the main thesis, that is the loss of the referent. And thirdly, if I have time, I will outline some of the strategies that we can use in order to cope with a new epistemic crisis. But first of all, I want to make a point straight about Lotman, because this is often a source of confusion. So for Lotman and Piatigorsky, value, which was mentioned yesterday, is attached to texts via material fixation. Now, the material fixation gives a surplus of meaning, which marks the difference between texts and non-texts. This means that culture gives value to a text through the expression of the text itself. So, for instance, written texts have more value than oral texts in certain cultures, or what is engraved in stone or in some precious material is considered text as distinct from what is written on perishable materials. Now, it is my contention that, as compared to written cultures and oral cultures, in digital cultures, there has been a gradual loss of the function of the signifier in order to index the value of texts, and in particular the values of truthfulness. Now, about human faces. Certainly there is a long pedigree about the connection between faces and indexical signs. First of all, in the history of semiotics, you will find illustrations of the so-called natural semiosis. Just bear in mind the signa naturalia of Augustine. In anthropology, faces have been used as examples of unintentional cues in communication. Think about the famous example of Clifford Geertz' unintentional winking of the eye. In biology, Charles Darwin has used faces in order to study the expressions of emotions in animals and in man. But the place where you find a lot of illustrations of faces as indexes is certainly ancient physiognomy as well as the medical tradition of semiotics. Physiognomy was predicated upon the principle of identity, which posits that there exists a tight link between characteristic sign of the face and character of people, and that one is the cause and the other is the effect. Physiognomy indeed unifies together, so facial traits and character in one single type. For example, large, protruding ears would signify fearfulness, or a receding chin would signify falsehood, etc., etc. But also in the so-called medical semiotics, you find examples of faces as indexes. Indeed, facial signs are often taken as symptoms of the disease. In fact, it is not a coincidence that symptoms are often included into the typology of signs. Take, for instance, the famous typology laid out by Thomas Sebeok, or the typology of signs, one of the typology of signs of Umberto Eco, where symptoms are included. I will now move from an organic understanding of faces to an analog representation in order to show you some examples where such representations hold a tight link between image and a referent. The first example is mirror reflections, which perhaps is the tightest that you can get in terms of the connection between a face image and its referent. Indeed, the face reflected in a mirror is a very good example of a double, as it duplicates the subject or object in front of the mirror. Whether mirror reflection is a sign or not, we can discuss about this, but the property of duplication of mirrors is in plain sight. However, what should be emphasized here is that mirror reflections have a close connection with the referent. Without the referent, indeed, mirror reflection would not exist at all. So the image reflected into the mirror is essentially bounded to the object it reflects. So this means that the image is causally produced by the object, and it cannot be produced in the absence of it. Second example is the death mask. This example is discussed di semiotica generale in his theory of sign production. As you see, in this case, the connection between death mask and the face of the dead person is quite literal, as it factors in the production of the sign itself. Eco writes indeed that masks, in this case death masks, are examples of congruencies or casts, which indeed, and I quote, in which, and I quote, a point of the physical space of the expression corresponds to each point in the space of the real object. Even if you take the classical example of a general face mask, so as a face covering, there is always a connection between what is hidden, in this case the face, and what is apparent, the mask. So this connection still permeates all these examples. The last illustration is coming from analog photography. In this case, the relation between the object and its representation is continuous, its status is indexical, it is a sign that is an imprint, a trace, a cast, an index of the object, inasmuch as there is a correspondence and a physical connection with the object. So photography, and in particular analog photography, brought in two main changes. First, the technical reproducibility of the image meant that the image can be reproduced infinitely, and secondly, that the image is detached from the here and now. So what do we gain from all this? In the regime of indexical semiosis, signs are used as evidence, as proofs, and have an epistemic validity. It does not mean that they cannot lie. Indeed, they can lie, but they can anyway lie. But there is the fact that this process of altering the sign is still in place. So I would say that in this case, a total erasure of the sign cannot exist, because every erasure leaves the trace of this operation. But what is different then with digital representations of faces? And we come to the last bit. So the introduction of digital images is a game changer. This is a radical change and a paradigm shift, because the connection that we discussed so far between images and referent is obliterated. The emergence of the synthetic image indeed marks the detachment of the image from the object. The image created ex nihilo from existing image archives is a pure simulation. So images become simulacra in the true sense of the word. When speaking about simulacra, the immediate reference is to the works of Jean Baudrillard, as early as in 1995 with Perfect Crime, and also to his more recent studies about the intelligence of evil. Baudrillard foresaw the radical change introduced with digital images, which created what he calls integral reality or hyperreality. Whereas in analog photography, in analog representations, there is still a relationship between the image and the represented reality, such that there is still a trace of it, an imprint of reality remains, but in the case of digital image, this bond, this link is basically eroded. So according to Baudrillard, the crime is perfect and it leaves no traces. According to Baudrillard, digital images marks the death of the reference, so to speak. In other words, the referent disappears. Here is a quote from Baudrillard himself. In the virtual reality, the substitution of the world is total. This is an identical doubling of the world, its perfect mirroring. We have moved then from object reality to a later stage, a kind of ultra-reality that puts an end to both reality and illusion. The computer-generated image is like this too, a digital image which is entirely fabricated, has no real referent, and from which, by contrast with analog images, the negative itself has disappeared. So what can we glean as a conclusive remarks from this discussion? First of all these theories converge on a single point, that the synthetic and digital images nullifies the referent in terms of semiotics. However, the indexicality present in these images is not a true indexicality, but is a pseudo-indexicality that is an effect of indexicality. In these types of images, indexicality is no longer in place as the connection with the referent is permanently lost, but these images can be thought as signs of indexes and therefore are pseudo-indexes. In other words, computer-generated images capitalizes on the epistemic value that photography and videos possess in order to achieve a very convincing effect of authenticity. Needless to say, they can be very convincing and formally perfect, but it doesn't mean they do denotate. This said, I believe that a technophobic scenario will not help us. I believe that semiotics can instead be part of a network of disciplines that work towards the creation of a new ecology of media and a semioethics that puts back the individual, the awareness, and the responsibility of the person at the center of the debate. Perhaps we need a new philosophy of digital technology, biosemiotically oriented at the center, of which is personal responsibility and personal awareness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Remo, for such a stunning presentation, and we have possibility only for one question.
Thank you for this very inspiring presentation. I really very much appreciate pointing out the loss of the referent, which may seem harmless at the beginning, but it can have long-term severe consequences, because the sign relation is actually a trust relation, in my opinion, that must be kept up. And the loss of the referent in the long run will detach this sign relation from the ground and may lead to loss of trust, which is really very crucial. So I really appreciate that you are proposing awareness as a reference. So my question would be, how could you integrate into technology, or at least technological ethics, such that decision makers are aware of the fact that they are playing with the trust climate that is crucial to anything we can do as humans and human beings. Could you comment on that?
Thank you for the question and the comments. I take the stance that I don't believe that the people that work in technology fields are intending to do anything about it. But I believe that us, from our disciplines, in particular the field of semiotics, can take a stance, and this stance has to be decided what kind of stance it is, whether whether the direction is a pedagogical direction, perhaps, in order to point out what are the fallacies of these types of images, or integrate also, like I said, a sort of a semioethics, and that will make us aware both of the possibilities, but also of the pitfalls that we somewhat encounter in this type of texts. Bear in mind that Baudrillard was writing in the 90s, and a lot has been happening in the past 20 years or so, and perhaps even more will happen in the next 10 or 15 years. So my point here was to try of giving some sort of a signposts taken from general semiotics that could help to provide a framework for understanding those types of images.